This is the first of two discussions I'm going to be having, a panel discussion about the momentous events of the weekend, and not so much picking through their causes, but actually examining their consequences. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Scott Lucas, who is a political analyst with more than 30 years' experience, including a wide range of interests from academic expertise to journalism and public media, as well as digital engagement. Scott is a regular contributor to international TV, radio, and digital outlets. He's a professor at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham. We're also joined by James Ker-Lindsay, who is an academic and analyst with internationally recognized expertise on Southeast Europe. That includes the Balkans, Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus. He has extensive experience working in government, private sector, higher education, and think tanks. He is also a regular commentator for the international media, including BBC, CNN, and Reuters, and was formerly co-editor of the Cyprus Review. And the last member of our panel is Piotr Kurzin. Piotr is a commentator and YouTube host on the subjects of geopolitical risk, global macroeconomics, and current affairs. He is half British and half Russian, and as he describes himself, a product of the Cold War, which has made him endlessly curious about why the world is what it is. He hosts contrasting conversations with diverse guests, often contrasting perspectives and expertise to help audiences become more informed about global events. So let's jump straight in with the difficult questions. It seems that we all know what's happened over the weekend. Of course, the details about the person who was wielding the gun are coming out, etc. They'll be endlessly discussed. But it does seem that at the moment, the legacy media, as well as social media, the discussion is really weighted towards the causes and not the consequences of what has happened. Scott, let's start with you. What's your thoughts on that?
From my own point of view, not just analyzing this, but just personally, I think there was an immediate link of causes and consequences within moments of the shooting taking place. I happened to be working with a British media outlet, uh, which that night afternoon in Pennsylvania when it happened, and so we went into that mode of trying to figure out what we know, what we don't know. But what I was struck by as they played the video again and again with Trump was not just the iconic image. And of course, the iconic image, which I'm sure your viewers and your listeners will know, is of him surrounded by the Secret Service agents, blood spattered on his cheek from where his ear was nicked by the bullet, his arm stretched up to a blue sky in which flows an American flag. And that image taken by Evan Vucci of the AP, and Evan's a great photographer, but you knew that was going to be an iconic photograph, especially for the Trumpist line of this man who had braved death and had triumphed. And so that's proving, but I think it was equally important to go back to what happened just before that photograph because of what was said. Of course, the Secret Service agents immediately put Trump on the ground after they realized that he'd been nicked and there was gunfire going on. When Trump gets back up, and he gets back up pretty quickly, he tries to clear some space amongst them and he shouts, "Wait, wait, wait." Now, some people said that's because he's trying to get his shoes back on, which he actually is calling "wait, wait, wait" to do a couple of other things. The first is that that's when he throws his arm up in the air, that clenched fist pose. And then he shouts at the crowd, "Fight, fight, fight," to which they respond. And this in itself is significant. If you grow up in American culture, they just chant USA, 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 which is a chant that started in Reagan's America of the 1980s around the Olympics. And the reason why it struck me immediately as we were trying to break through not what was happening, but what the consequences was that Trump had used almost the exact same words he had used on January 6, 2021, outside the White House when he was calling on supporters to march on the Capitol to stop the confirmation of Joe Biden as president. So what had happened in those moments is that Trump, who of course, remember, is a reality TV star, as a politician, whose idea is based on striking that moment, creating that moment for people, whether it was being on The Apprentice, whether it was being in the World Wrestling Federation. He had found the pose, and then he almost instinctively had made the call to arms. Because this is the broader context for me when we talk about consequences. You have to go back to go forward. America has a history of political violence. We can talk about the assassinations of 4 US presidents. We could talk about the attempted assassinations. The last one before Saturday of a president, well, the last one of a president was Ronald Reagan in 1981 when he was wounded by John Hinckley. We can talk about the recent political violence. Gabby Giffords, the US Senator from Arizona, critically wounded 2011. Steve Scalise, Representative Republican, seriously wounded 2017. Kidnapping plot, Gretchen Whitmer, 2020. She's the Michigan governor. And the Capitol attack, January 6, 2021. We can talk all about that political violence. Trump is distinctive here in the social media environment, in this political, cultural moment, because he built his career on a politics of violence. You know, this is a man who, in his 2016 campaign, was calling for hecklers to be attacked by his supporters. He called later for demonstrators to be attacked, including those of Black Lives Matter. He's called for violence against migrants, against asylum seekers, against journalists, of course, against the left. That's his modus operandi. And in the hours after the attack, while most Republicans condemned it and joined the Democrats, including Presidents Biden and Obama, in calling no place for political violence in our society, the core group of Trumpists were magnifying that politics of division and violence. And, you know, for the sake of time, I won't go through it at this point, but we're talking about Donald Trump Jr., Marjorie Taylor Greene, the conspiracy theorist representative from Georgia, Steve Scalise, who, of course, had been that victim of gun violence in 2017, who's blaming Democrats and the radical left, 2 vice presidential candidates, J.D. Vance, Tim Scott. And the narrative was building, which is us versus Trump's enemies. And despite the fact that in the last 24 hours, the Trump campaign is trying to recalibrate by putting out a message of unity, which we'll see if they do that at the Republican convention. The consequences going forward is just that reminder that Donald Trump has said, if I get back into the White House, January 2025, on day one, I will act like a dictator and I will seek retribution against my enemies.
And Lauren Boebert, of course, is another notable. So it's the familiar faces who, many of whom, of course, are trying to justify the 6th of January insurrection and, you know, trying to get that label removed from it. James, what's your take on the immediate sort of causes and consequences?
Well, you know, I think sort of coming at this from, if you like, from a European angle, rather than a North American, you know, and sort of recognizing it's got sort of personal sort of links to the country. I mean, I think, you know, like many others, there's that immediate sense of, has this changed the political calculation in the United States and how things are going to be going into the election? You know, I think there does seem to be the immediate reaction is, well, Trump's sewn it up. Especially with all the problems that we've seen with Biden. You know, obviously there was the whole debate issue, but then all the gaffes that were made during the NATO, you know, the NATO summit, which had anyway cast this very, very, you know, deep pall over the Biden, you know, candidacy going into the election, and then to see something like this, and you know, and that iconic image. You know, how quickly that has circulated. Now, you know, it's going to be on T-shirts, it's going to be on hats, and it really is quite an incredible image. And so I think there's probably a sense that, well, it looked like it was heading in Trump's direction, especially with what was happening with Biden anyway, but has this pushed it over? Now, of course, there is 3.5 months to go, but I would imagine that in all the foreign ministries in Europe, and in actual fact, in all the prime ministerial offices, presidential offices around Europe, there will be some very, very serious thinking now and planning for what this is going to mean for European security, European international relations, the transatlantic relationship, NATO. I mean, really, we are in a very, very uncertain time. We were in an uncertain time. We're going to be in a far, far more uncertain time.
And that's an interesting thread to pick up, whether this actually might have been a crucial stimulus for Europe to wake up to the threats and to do what many Ukrainians have done, is get over their internal bickering, their internal left-right paradigm, and knock about everyday politics in order to survive. Europe seems not to have got into that mindset at this point, and the existential threat from Russia does not seem to be, if it is sinking in, it's not being communicated forcefully to electorates, despite the apparent plot to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall and various other sabotage across Europe. Let's carry on with that point there, and then we'll turn back to sort of, Trump's political instincts. So, Scott, do you think this is going to be a wake-up call? Is this going to put European preparation, move it on from the sort of glacial pace that we're seeing to something a lot more forceful and willful?
For some folks, it may be glacial, but Europe has already been moving. They've already been moving for several months. And I think perhaps at least the catalyst in the Ukraine theater was when the Trumpists blocked the American $60 billion military aid package last October and held it up for what eventually was 6 months before it got through in April. I think at that point, not looking both at the immediate composition of where Congress was with the number of Trumpists who were in Congress, but then also the possibilities that Trump would win in 2024. You saw a lot more movement on the EU. Also, I must add, because of other factors such as Viktor Orban, Putin's man inside the EU. That's why, for example, you saw the EU, an absolute priority that they had to get that 50 billion euro fund approved now to make sure that you got financial and economic support for Ukraine. You hoped, and indeed it did come through. So Europe's friends in the US, you might say, made sure that the military aid package did get through in April, because that $60 billion, of course, can be dispersed unless Trump goes to extraordinary measures. It can be dispersed after he becomes president. It's also, by the way, why the ammunition initiative, given the EU's failure to deliver the 1 million shells by March, why it was sort of reframed as a Czech initiative under Petropavl and is ongoing. So I think you're seeing folks realize you cannot count, it's not even a case of America leads, we follow. You can't on America being alongside you in the Trump years. Now, how far can you continue to support Ukraine if America's on the sidelines? That's the huge question we face. But I will add a reminder here in the American domestic context, because American media is almost not even noticing that. One of their numerous failures in the way they're covering this election is the composition of the House and of the Senate. Both House and Senate are on knife edges. And it makes a huge difference whether you have a Democratic majority in one house or even potentially in both houses, although that's a longer shot, or whether the Republicans have a majority, which would give Trump effectively a lock or a near lock on policy. So, you have to go beyond Trump versus Biden, and you have to read this in terms of what happens with the American legislators and American agencies, because what Europe has also been preparing for is those links with those US agencies, intelligence services, defense, the Treasury. We know that Trump, because Project 2025 makes it an open secret, Trump wants to take those agencies apart and politicize them. So it's a question of the US agencies working with Europe to try to firewall against that.
I think there will certainly, and I mean, I agree. I think, there will have been a lot of planning that's going on, but I think the big worry is that without the United States, what is NATO's ability to help Ukraine? What is NATO's ability to work on broader European security? It's a question also of Britain outside of the European Union. I think the fact that we do now have a new government in the UK will be tremendously beneficial in this regard. I mean, obviously, Starmer has been very clear that he doesn't envisage returning to the core of the European Union. Rejoining the European Union is obviously off the agenda, as is single market and customs union, although many people hope that that will start to shift. But we're not talking immediately. This is going to be down the road. But one area that we have already seen some very positive moves on, and I think a lot of us who work on defence and security had hoped that this would happen, is that there is plenty of room for Britain to cooperate on foreign policy issues and to get involved in, for example, speak with the European Union and say, listen, Britain can still contribute a lot. We've got a lot of these common interests. Can we sit in on Foreign Affairs Council meetings, for example, and taking part in a more formalized way? Now, I mean, the calculation of Starmer's going to have to take is, all right, he's got a fantastic majority and everything like that, but I think he's still running a bit scared of the right-wing media in the UK and how that will be presented. So, whether it would be an extremely formalized relationship or something a bit looser will remain to be seen. But I think it's very clear that the direction of travel at the moment seems to be more towards working. But we can't forget that, no matter how much the European countries put into defense, the United States is a behemoth when it comes to defense spending. I mean, it is often eye-watering to realize that if you take the top 10 countries in the world for defense spending, the United States, you could take the next 9 and add them together, and the United States would either be on a par or would still be beyond it. And that's taking into account Russia, China, UK, Italy, France, Germany. It is absolutely enormous, the US defense budget. I mean, now we also have to understand that the USA shapes its defense budget in a slightly different way. So a lot of things that, for example, in European countries would fall under other government departments will often come under DoD in the United States. But we are nevertheless talking of, close to $1 trillion a year in defense spending. There is just no way that Europe's going to be able to make that up and bring on board the technologies and everything. So if we did find that a Trump administration said, okay, we're just not going to be taking part anymore, I mean, whether that means a full withdrawal from NATO or even just simply saying, look, we're just not going to be providing the equipment anymore. We're not going to commit to supporting Ukraine in the same way. It's not a NATO issue. Then it's going to be extremely difficult for Europe to be able to pick up that slack with all the implications that carries. So I think even though we can see a lot of movement in Europe towards trying to work together, hopefully a lot more cooperation with Britain working with its European partners, the loss of the United States, in just basic military terms, it'll be irreplaceable, frankly.
And of course, we'll come to a minute the extremely divisive conversation about where Trump's interests lie. Well, we know that his interests always lie with himself, but beyond that, who he's going to align himself and with policies to enrich himself and his family and so on. We'll come to that in a second, because I've spoken to many people right across the spectrum, including people who formerly worked in Obama's national security team, who are of the view that actually Trump might go all in against Russia. And there's an extraordinary range of opinion there. But let's start with that moment, because I think, Scott, you said something interesting which has wider implications. On the one hand, we have many analysts coming out and saying, oh, well, what's happened here is not going to change the dynamic of the elections, because assassinations, these kind of things don't. We can see the example in the UK before the Brexit vote, where the murder of MP Joe Cox didn't seem to push the needle at all, unfortunately, on that debate. People then went into the booths and they voted in a way that they were intending to do so, despite the divisiveness of that election. But this seems to me counter-logical. If you look at Trump, you've got many people today, Michael McFaul and others, and going yesterday, describing his acts as brave, that punch in the air that Scott has described. Many are trying to seek some kind of heroism in this. This is not a character, if you follow him closely, who is necessarily associated with heroism through his career. In fact, quite the reverse. He's a convicted felon, and then there are many. We could talk for hours about the number of accusations that are leveled against him. But in that moment, he seemed to be the consummate marketeer, despite the extreme danger and the security services trying to keep him down. If you see the Reagan equivalent, you know, very, very sort of different scenario. I think he immediately grasped, as Scott said, the marketing value, the campaign value. This to me says that he is going to make enormous capital out of this. We'll later come to how Russia could perhaps pour petrol on the flames, but I think he instinctively, he believes this is going to have a huge impact on the poll numbers. I'd love to hear what you guys think.
In terms of the likelihood that it gives Trump the boost and that you have to prepare for that, I would add probably a couple of points from my perspective, which are not to predict the election results. I've been burned by predicting election results in the past. I'm not going to do it again. But I'd say that the factors are, point one, that I think if you had spoken to me last Friday, I would have said this is the week that Joe Biden steps aside as the candidate for the Democratic nomination. I think the pressure was there from the donors, from the activists, from Democratic politicians. That dynamic completely changed over the weekend because now you have a president who is saying we need to show unity, we need to show resilience. You can't replace Biden in that moment. And the window was very, very short for the Democrats. You had to really do this before the Democratic convention on August the 19th, or it doesn't happen. And I do think that Biden, you know, as an admirer of what the administration has done in terms of domestic legislation, mixed feelings on its foreign policy for different reasons. I think Biden's a liability as a campaigner going through to November, because that's tied to a second point, and that is spectacle has completely sucked all the oxygen out of discussing the issues in the United States, not just the issues we've been discussing here with Russia and Ukraine. I'm talking about the most important domestic issues since 1865. Women's rights, including abortion rights, climate change, healthcare, education, immigration, the economy, and the threat to democracy. When was the last time you looked in the American media and had a really detailed discussion of those issues? Because instead, the narrative up until last weekend was old Joe, old Joe, old Joe, which does two things. One is it completely pushes those issues and the administration's a record to the side. And secondly, gives Trump a free pass. Convicted felon, sex offender, fraudster, coup plotter. And I think that pattern continues. I think I wouldn't have predicted the election based on Trump alone, because I think Trump could implode at any point, which we did see in 2020. Remember that he said after another threat to his life from COVID, I am immune. But Americans didn't take that very well, or a lot of Americans didn't take that very well, and it actually damaged him. Here, I think he could implode if he was very divisive and so on. I think it's the Biden factor and the negligence of American media that pretty much paves the way for him to win in November.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I had exactly that sort of sense about Biden as well, that this is probably the moment that has passed for replacing him. And I think what I would find worrying is that, you know, within the Democrat Party, that there is a sense that, well, look, we'll just have to resign ourselves to a Trump victory. We'll regather our forces and look for 4 years down the road. But I think a lot of people would say 4 years, we saw exactly what happened under the last Trump administration, which was inept, that he was finding his way around. This time, as everyone says, he knows what he's going into. He knows what he wants to achieve. And that will be a very, very worrying time. Now, I think, you know, there's the whole domestic agenda that we can talk about, and on foreign policy. I think, you know, the thing that really, I think, stood out for me very much under the previous Trump administration was the loss of talent, you know, across US government and especially in State Department. A lot of just people, good people, just simply said, look, I'm coming up for retirement. I'm not going to go out and sell these policies. I'm just going to take it and go. And so there'd been a hollowing out, and one had hoped, you know, 4 years is probably not enough time to replace that senior leadership. And so to come in and then have another bout of this, I think is really, really worrying in terms of sort of US external policy and its relations with the wider world. You know, we can perhaps talk about specific areas and things like that. I think the one thing I would say, which you had brought up, which if there is a silver lining, is that ultimately Trump thinks about Trump. And so, you know, it is very much the art of the deal, which doesn't necessarily mean that he is going to be running headlong into a pro-Russian position. I can see that. But it does cause chaos in other ways, precisely because he doesn't try and think long-term about foreign policy or try and develop a meaningful strategy from it. So if one is to take a more benign view of the previous Trump administration, it wasn't that it was outright malicious what we were seeing, but it was utterly disorganized. And that is what becomes also so dangerous in the current environment. So yes, we will really worry if he takes a very pro-Russian position. But even if he doesn't, for all the reasons we've outlined, that even if he just simply says, look, I'm not going to get engaged in NATO, so not necessarily taking an outright pro-Moscow position, but just simply saying, I'm just going to do my own thing. I'm going to just do these deals where I can spot them and be able to sell them at a domestic level. This in turn will cause all sorts of chaos, which, you know, not just European allies will have to deal with, but also allies in other parts of the world. You know, so thinking very much about sort of relations with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. You know, it's going to be a very, very confusing time in that regard as well.
And of course, we've seen his instincts seem to be to ally, at least for media purposes, with autocrats, because you know that's one, it's easier. Two, it seems to create far more divisive headlines, and of course a lot of his publicity feeds on this divisiveness. Well, let's tackle sort of two big topics, I think, in the time we've got. One is, how is Russia going to try to leverage this? Is it, and we actually see some early signs of this already happening, is it likely to intervene on the probability of Trump victory? Of course, technically they've come out and said they'd love Biden to be president. That seems completely odds with what the propagandists are actually saying. So what is Russia going to do to play this card to its maximum advantage? And then lastly, we'll talk about the implications for Ukraine itself, because Russia, in its position of current relative weakness, seems to be pushing the peace or freeze the lines of contact, or pushing for as much as it can, trying to even get, you know, territory that it doesn't currently occupy. But there seems to be this acknowledgement in the Kremlin that, you know, that they need a pause in order to regroup and potentially have another crack again at Ukraine. So there's these two issues. What's Russia going to do to leverage the situation? And then what are they doing on the so-called peace front, and how a Trump presidency might affect that? Well, Piotr, let's bring you in on this one. You're a close observer of what happens in Russia and Russian propaganda, as am I. What are your views on how the Kremlin can leverage this dramatic situation?
I think that if Russia was intelligent, if the Kremlin was clever enough, they would do some of what Trump, up until the events on the weekend, has been doing, which is to allow the Biden campaign and the issue of Biden's age to self-sabotage. They will not do too much to, I think, risk worsening the situation. They don't necessarily need to do too much noise and allow the domestic US political situation to undermine itself. I think, you know, one of the biggest themes that we see being mentioned by observers of the great power rivalry is, you know, China and Russia are big threats to the United States and Western leadership, but arguably it is the United States' own domestic and political polarization and unity that is its biggest one. Because if it can't get its own house in order, so to speak, then you know, its own great power rivalries will have less to worry about in the longer term. And it's the same with any country, really. I mean, look at Britain now. We've just had our own election. And for the first time in 2 weeks, I've not seen too much political fanfare in the news, which is actually quite pleasant. what this means for Ukraine and what I think the Russians might do if they do decide to do something, I think also depends on how the Republican and Democrat conventions go. Milwaukee is going to be very important to see the sort of energy that Trump is bringing, but also the reception from his supporters, from people who are undecided still or who were until the events or over the weekend. If Trump is clever enough, he will continue to leverage this momentum that he has. And I don't necessarily, again, I haven't been focusing too much on the foreign policy aspect of this because I just don't think it's, number one, the most important yet. And number two, going to carry the most significant implications for Ukraine in the immediate to short term. But the Russians are definitely, I think, going to try to hammer home this sort of division and, sort of to, I don't know, use it as a basis to send messages, to posture across the international community and system. I mean, we couldn't see more of a difference in persona, right, with Putin meeting Modi, the bear hug, the illustration of sort of the non-alignment states being close with the, shall we say, non-Western axis. And then on the other side, we have a leadership, a country which has been at the forefront of global power, but it continues to, in some people's very, I think, happy minds, implode or at least deteriorate and decline. There is one element here, though, which I think is quite interesting, which is Biden. Now, he is obviously someone who is incredibly important for foreign policy, and I think he is the biggest supporter of Ukraine out of any foreign statesman, aside from the Ukrainian leadership itself. But what I think has been interesting in the past 24 hours, 48 hours, is we've seen Biden really almost come into his own. Have there been gaffes? Yes, the calling of Zelensky Putin is not good. Neither is VP Harris to Trump, but he is very good in crisis response and crisis management. And having observed his address at the White House yesterday, having seen his general demeanor in this situation around Trump, there are plenty of people who support Trump or are fed up with Biden or fed up with both who will be critical of his approach, but I'm not entirely sure what else he could do that's better. And what I'm saying by this is that he has shown remarkable, I think, leadership in this moment, and his illustration of expertise and depth when it comes to foreign policy, and just the way he spoke to the camera in such a very measured and steadfast way. It was reassuring. It's unfortunate he is a bit hypocritical of some of the points he's made about unity. But I think if he can continue to build on this, some people might begin to see, well, if Biden can be as decent as enough to call Trump to heighten the security at the Republican convention over the next few days, do things that, you might wonder, would Trump reciprocate if the roles were reversed, then maybe this might actually come to benefit Biden. And therefore, in the longer term, I'm going out on a bit of a speculation here, it might work out and therefore be beneficial for Ukraine and support in the longer term against the situation there.
Well, Scott, this is an interesting idea, and not one I'd contemplated that this could play in Biden's favor. My mind immediately, as anyone who observes Russia, goes to the worst possible scenario every time. Not necessarily always the case, however. In this instance, is Russia going to look at this and say, look, we don't have to do an awful lot here. The US may well sort of implode all on its own, and the sort of divisiveness we see only requires a little bit of, lighter fluid, not a big tank of petrol to be poured on the flames. How do you think they may approach this, not to, dare I say it, sabotage their own benefit here?
Even before, the events of last weekend, the playbook's been out there for months. All you have to do is read Russian media, open Russian media, state media in English in Russia. You don't even have to go to the Russian bots and the accounts on social media. And that is that, yes, of course, you bring up the division. You play upon the division in the United States. More broadly, you play upon the idea that there's racial tensions there. So they'll step in and try to widen, as they have done, playing both sides on Black Lives Matter. They will try to widen divisions over issues like women's rights and play that. They will try to indeed misrepresent the American economy. That's all out there. When you talk about the specifics with Biden and with Trump, the starting point, first all you have to remember is that the Russians know that they were caught in 2016. They know they had a lucky escape. Fact of the matter is, the American agencies, as we know through the indictments, as we know through the Mueller report, they know exactly what the Russians came in and did. And it's only because of Trump's people protecting him, like William Barr, that it didn't get worse for Russia in terms of the fallout, including Trump eventually facing the possibility of being removed from office or some type of criminal charges. Now, you don't want to get caught this time in 2024. So what do? You let the American news percolate. You let the idea of division and uncertainty play up, and then you magnify and then you amplify it. So what they've been doing for months with Biden is amplifying the idea that Biden is not fit for the job, while at the same time that Putin statement, we support, would rather have Biden in, was really interesting, because some people said, oh, it's Biden, it's Putin with this clever move that he's making. It was also a warning shot to Trump. Don't count on me necessarily backing you. So it was a shot at Trump's ego as well that was played out there. What they've done in recent days is well, immediately after the shooting was really interesting. What they did is they flooded the zone with misinformation and disinformation. So across social media, there were Russian accounts that were saying this was the shooter. He's affiliated with the left wing, putting out a photo of a very, very menacing bearded man and trying to grab the news narrative with that, which plays into the whole idea of Antifa, the left wing threat. It's not just the right wing threat, et cetera. So you can expect all that. Here's the broader point I would make about Trump, which goes beyond the election, which is the Russian threat. Remember that Trump's threat is not just a threat in terms of unpredictability, in terms of lying, disinformation. Remember that it's an organizational threat. And specifically here, Trump's threat against America's agencies responsible for cyber protection, responsible for protection of the media space. When it got to the point where Christopher Krebs was effectively thrown out as the head of America's cyber operations because he challenged Trump over the 2020 election, that's how far Trump would go at that point to protect himself then. What Trump was willing to do now is to put his own people into these agencies from the very start. So the idea of America being able to have the type of cyber monitoring that it has had on the Russian threat, that's gone if Trump comes in 2025.
The other example is the Chinese trainings in Belarus. And this has involved, people going, oh, the Chinese, they are conducting military drills with Belarus. The multipolar world is here. Europe is over. China is coming in. Okay, right. How many people went and trained with the Belarusians? One company. How many people are in a company? About 100 to 130 troops. It's not really enough to take over the entirety of Europe. So it's this kind of information where you deliberately leave out certain details. You make one very big banner sort of alert statement, which really grabs people's attentions, but then there's no nuance. People like to simplify geopolitics and international relations and things like this as black and white. It isn't. Anyone who says it is either is naive or have a malicious agenda. So and Russia plays into this very well. And the last point I wanted to make on what both Scott and James have said is that it's very cheap. They've been very effective at leveraging the cost of this. It's to hire a sort of a group of people to do this in physical terms. If you imagine this 20, 30 years ago when we didn't have the technology we do now, all you have to do is get a couple of very insecure people online, even think Jackson Hinkle, think people like that, who want some kind of validation, who want some kind of purpose in life, that they sell their souls. And this is very effective for foreign states, rogue states, nefarious actors to leverage.
And this is the challenge, isn't it? Because this this theory of being able to get more bang for your buck, Russia's actually rather good at it. So we're focusing on this idea, which is implausible, that Russia is going to take over France, Germany. We're talking about vast territories with vast resources, which is not really going to happen in the traditional military sense. But they can pay hoodlums, mafia, thugs, whoever, really relatively small amounts of money to cause absolute chaos. This is not theoretical, it is already happening. Arson, sabotage, assassination, these things are already happening, and they're outsourcing this sort of hybridized warfare at a fraction of the cost of traditional warfare. In fact, they've probably realized that it's far cheaper to do it this way than using the highly trained intelligence agents that they had in Europe, which have all now been expelled. So this is dangerous. As Russia goes on, it's learning how to fight hybrid war in a far more effective and economical fashion.
I think that it sort of goes back to one of the first points I added, which is that the Russians are learning that they don't necessarily need to do too much. They just need to let the United States do it itself, and they can add that supplementary fuel to the fire, inflammatory remarks, and incentivization amongst the right groups. I think people either deliberately misunderstand, or there's a gross simplification in the sense of when you hear, oh, Russia could beat the United States. Well, I mean, it depends how you define that, right? America has by far the most comprehensive and effective military, but we're talking about kinetic warfare. We're talking about conventional means and arms and technology, right? They're worlds ahead of the Russians, but what they don't seem to focus enough on are these very sort of asymmetrical methods, like disinformation, and the simplest of methods, troll farms. It's not exactly very imaginary, but it's downright effective. The Chinese, when they install, influencer agents is the official term for them, people who, who are advisors. If you remember, Jonathan, in the UK, a few months ago, maybe a year or so ago, we had that high senior civil servant or public official who was advising one of the members of the UK government, and he was actually being funded by the CCP. And this was found out through obviously various methods. But the point is that it's not a very conventional method. It's very covert. It's quite Cold War-esque. And I think America seems to be focusing a lot on its hardware. And if you do go toe to toe with the military, well, Russia would be overwhelmed, I think, against NATO. It's pretty clear. But they're not doing that. And this is where you see this these liabilities and shortcomings.
I was thinking there's international institutions that become effective, like the UN and many, many others. But there are also all sorts of military monitoring organizations. And as Piotr has just mentioned here, Five Eyes, which again, I haven't seen discussed. But this is almost certainly critical intelligence information that is giving Ukraine an advantage.
And absolutely, and it does come back to this sort of wider international perspective. And I think, the points that have been made are incredibly important. And I think Scott's sort of, element of sort of focusing on cyber is something that even now, I think that most people don't really truly grasp the impact of hybrid threats and the way that hybrid war is being waged, and how so many of the aspects, of traditional conflict have changed, and how adept that Russia has become, along with other countries, but specifically Russia, at weaponizing democracy. It works in a way that it is now extremely talented, if you like, at being able to sort of see what those wedge issues are and to play on it, and a very, very good awareness of psychology. And, so I think even now people don't really, they hear about bot farms and things and think, how damaging can it be? Because not realizing that when you see a controversial message and somebody would then say, well, it's only got one like, you just ignore it. But when you see a controversial message and it's got 20,000 likes, natural psychology says something, and it has become extremely good at this. And I think that point about sort of playing on Biden's age, you just need one person to put out that message, and then you amplify it by giving it lots of likes. You come in with the comments. Yeah, I agree. I've been thinking the same myself. All of this plays very, very cleverly into psychology, and is so utterly damaging in a way that I think, as I say, that many people still, after all this time, and that's leaving aside all the different types of other activities that you can do. What we've seen is weaponizing migration, busing people to borders and just pushing them across, knowing that this is going to be very, very disruptive within societies. Maybe not something that the United States has certainly seen, but it's definitely been a very big issue here in Europe in one way or another. So I think all of this is extremely worrying. And when you then start to say the US could be cutting back on those agencies which are at the forefront of trying to tackle these hybrid threats, then we can see that things will just get worse and worse.
I think that the agency point is pertinent because it obviously filters into international agencies. And I think one of the ones that isn't talked about enough, but would be significant again if we're keeping in Ukraine in the constant sort of theme, is Five Eyes. And I've heard very little about what Trump would do with Five Eyes. For people who aren't familiar, Five Eyes is a collective organizational agreement between the Anglo-Saxon states, and they've been very, I think, instrumental in supporting Ukraine in different phases of the conflict. And if Trump were to try to, should we say, defund, not completely leave NATO, I think that would trickle down also into Five Eyes and areas like that, which would be even more concern for European unity and effective defense against sort of any, shall we say, ideas that the Kremlin has about post-Ukraine sort of conflict. I think there's a couple of examples that we've seen in recent days alone, which I think illustrate what James is getting at. The first one about this bullseye, that Biden made the comments that we need to put Trump within the bullseye. And immediately what you see trolls and anyone, be them bots as well, doing is pushing this narrative that Biden obviously meant to put him in front of a literal firearm bullseye, which if anyone of reasonable mind would know, he meant to reorientate the focus away from his mental and psychological capacity and health, and to focus as a party. He was addressing his own Democratic Party to, Trump's threats or threat as an opposition and so on, right? That's what he meant. But bots are very good at framing it. And for people who are, should we say, more manipulatable or just distrustful of mainstream media and the establishment, quote unquote, they will take it at face value.
If we fall into the trap of divisive politics, we might presume that Trump is this, Trump is that, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. And combine it with Scott's interesting comment that Putin publicly saying he was backing Biden could have been a shot across the bows just to remind Trump of certain things. Who knows what those are? But it's probably better not to fall into that trap, but nonetheless to prepare for the worst. So if you apply this to Ukraine, and of course, this whole episode has been talking about the US, but ultimately what we're thinking about here is what the implications are for Ukraine. The implication is uncertainty, which means they need to prepare to defend themselves. They need to prepare to build their own domestic military production and reduce dependency on Europe and America, because it'll be nice if they get that stuff, but perhaps their calculus will be that these things are no longer a given.
Yes, certainly. The comments about, I'll start with Biden and Putin and Trump, because I think it's more important to end on Ukraine. But yeah, look, I think Putin is not an idiot. We may well detest this individual, but he is rational, and he is I don't know if you want to call him a chess player, but he has some degree of intellectual competency. And he does know that Biden is far more experienced and predictable than Donald Trump. I mean, I think those were his words effectively. But he strongly disagrees with the policies done by Biden. I think it shows you just what kind of individual Trump is, that even Putin is wary of the guy being, at least for round two, because we saw what Trump wanted to do in certain ways in his first term and wasn't able to. And since then, a lot of people argue that Trump was better for global stability and peace. I don't think it's as simple as that. Yes, he did do some remarkable achievements like the Abraham Accords, but that wasn't purely down to him. It was also down to the team that he had around him, of which many have left since then because they cannot stand what Trump became in the latter part of his presidency, right? A lot of the very senior politicians and experienced should we say field agents or secretaries stood aside because they didn't agree with his approach. And I think Putin I think would welcome a Trump presidency in the immediate term of what it means for Ukraine. I don't think he'd like it with necessarily everything else, because America and Russia do have sort of, a collective desire not to go to nuclear war, or at least we like to think so. Putin says he will threaten nuclear war, but never does it. So there's a lot of, I think, unpredictability here. But I think Biden is someone that Putin knows how to deal with, at least more recently. And because of how the situation in America has gotten worse, we've had COVID since, we've had a lot of shock events, inflection points, flashpoints that have made the world even more disrupted and unstabilized than it was 4 or 5 years ago. And Putin's calculus might have changed. And therefore, when he sees Trump potentially coming back in and this idea of Project 2025, which again, he may well welcome in his own way, in others it doesn't. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in the American theatre, but also what countries are saying either tacitly by sort of subtly implying, or just outright in their words explicitly. And as for Ukraine, obviously Trump is the worst possible outcome we can imagine. The Ukrainians are, I think, very innovative in the way that they've utilized and implemented some of the equipment that the West, NATO, Americans have shared with them. And even when there's been, shall we say, a bit of a starvation or depletion of supplies, they have been very very novel, very innovative with utilizing what little bits they have remaining in quite imaginative ways. I'm thinking of the maritime theatre and the Black Sea, and how they've managed to make off the Black Sea a graveyard for the Russian naval assets, despite not having really a navy. This
And
is
even with the
obviously
lack of
something that I think
ammunition,
it's
Russia's not. Even with the lack of
Yes.
ammunition, Russia's not made the sort of headway you'd expect against an army that has, significantly lower ratio of, say, 155 millimeter. Russia just didn't really make any inroads in that 6 to 8 months, which again shows perhaps an extraordinary degree of not just willingness and bravery, but innovation to keep the front line static.
Just think there's a lot of hot air when it comes to this sort of thing, and and this whole notion that, well, Russia is destroying Ukraine, or they're so going to win. Well, it's not. Let's take a step back and actually look at what the original event of this was. It was the second largest country's military taking on the 21st most effective, and that was just after 8 years of being trained by NATO, so not exactly a long time to get interoperability and normalization of this across the whole country. And they're still withstanding this second most powerful military, right? You look at it in the right framing on what Russian trolls and Kremlinites like to do. It's framed that Ukraine is going to be steamrolled. Well, if they were going to be steamrolled, they would have done it by now. And the territorial composition of about 18% hasn't changed since the Ukrainians' remarkable counteroffensive of October 2022. So let's just forget about that. But to wrap this up with what you asked me originally, also is, I think, for Ukraine, this is incredibly important that they do develop their own industry. And they have been doing this. They have been trying to get their in-house ammunition supplies and production facilities up and running, which is obviously not a quick fix. And I think the Biden administration is going to do all it can. We saw that, additional package that was announced at the NATO summit, which in itself, I think, is worth a discussion, being announced. And I think this is going to be, I think things are going to be very important for the next 6 months for Ukraine, and as much preparatorial and precautionary measures and actions taken in case that the worst possible scenario of a Trump presidency does realize in November. And then it really is a question of how much Europe can pull its, or excuse me, but finger out. I really do think Europe needs to be self-autonomous, strategically autonomous. That's why I do appreciate Macron's comments in that regard. And Britain as well. Where will England and the UK be in this role of defence and intelligence and military engagement?
I think my overall view is of course, this is a deeply concerning time. I think there is a lot of worry about what Trump's going to mean. For a Trump victory would mean, seeing as I think more and more would seem to be betting that it's now looking more and more likely that we're going to be going in that direction. And it really will mean that Europe is going to have to get its act together and start thinking a lot more seriously about what it can be doing to defend itself. Can it, or will it be able to pick up any slack that might come up from the United States? And again, in some ways, I think we do have to be a little bit careful about naturally just gravitating to the worst case scenario the whole time with a Trump victory. But it is that old adage, you prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
Thank you so much for the chats. I think probably it's just a reminder of perhaps the inspiration in the darkness in 2016, when Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high, and just holding on to something that I first started as my personal mantra back then that I try to cling into, which is, folks, just be decent and be good to each other, especially with whatever comes in the coming months. So thank you, Jonathan, James, Peter. Thanks so much, and we'll see you down the road.